Hello and welcome back to our special series on FP Live. It's called America Votes, What It Means for the World. I'm Ravi Agrawal, the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy. Today's episode is focused on Latin America. This is a region that encompasses America's biggest global trading partner, that's Mexico, by the way. And then going south from there, it includes Central America, the Caribbean, and all of the countries on the continent of South America, from big countries like Brazil to smaller ones like Belize. This is an important part of the world, and we are here today to discuss how US presidential candidates Donald Trump and Kamala Harris differ on their policies there. We've already run episodes on the Middle East, Europe, and Africa. You can watch them on foreignpolicy.com/live. Joining me today are two terrific guests. Catherine Osborn is the writer of FP's weekly Latin America brief. She is usually based in Brazil. She happens to be in the United States for this recording. And Moisés Naím is the chief international columnist for El País. He served as Venezuela's Minister of Trade and Industry from 1989 to 1990. Most importantly for this audience, he is a former editor-in-chief of this magazine where he's done many great things. Moisés and Catherine, welcome to FP Live.
Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you for having us.
It's such a pleasure. So Catherine, I'm going to start with you. Broad strokes. If you are living in Sao Paulo or Santiago, pick your big city. How do people contrast the two candidates' policies towards Latin America?
Interestingly, both candidacies, either the candidates themselves or their advisors, say they would support closer economic ties with Latin America as part of de-risking from China. In Trump's case, it's his advisors who are saying this. But of course, Trump's tariff proposals would make that very complicated. When it comes to their record, Latin Americans remember Trump's policy toward the region as kind of lopsided in that it was extremely focused on certain countries, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Mexico, and on certain issues like immigration and the US-Mexico trade relationship. It was an America first policy in that it reached for tools in the foreign policy toolkit without really taking into account concerns from countries in the region about their side effects, particularly sanctions. And with the Biden-Harris administration, policy has included more countries and more issues. So it's focused more on economic partnerships. It's been more reciprocal when it comes to hearing Latin American concerns on things like sectoral sanctions, on the flow of guns from the US to the region. When it comes to immigration, it's incorporated concerns from the region too. Biden and Harris were also more involved in diplomacy to shore up electoral integrity in Latin America, whereas when the Trump administration saw an anti-democratic scenario, they would reach for other tools, which even included threats of regime change. So those are a little bit of the differences in, I think, tone and tactics that have marked at least their records in the past.
Moisés, let me bring you in. I'm wondering if you agree there. And there are, of course, some areas where there are similarities, just as there are differences that Catherine has pointed out.
Everything that Catherine said is correct and part of the story and part of the analysis. But you started out saying that Latin America is a very important region. Well, that's not the case. It's important just because of its two main exports, which are drugs and people. But in general, years ago, I wrote an article about the lost continent, which was Latin America. And I cited what a very senior policymaker in the United States told me about Latin America when I told him about how irrelevant it seemed. They said, well, you guys in Latin America are not competitive, you're not an economic powerhouse as India or China. You're not a nuclear power. Poverty is dire, but nothing compared to Africa and Asia. You don't have religious terrorism. You're highly indebted. You're not competitive, not even as a threat to the United States. And we're always, as a superpower, very busy with other emergencies. So when the day starts and the president receives the daily brief from his intelligence services, Latin America seldom figures. So I am just providing this as a context for the conversation. Let's not
And
make it
it's
sound
great.
like more elaborate than what it is.
Yeah, and Moisés, that's great context. Some of what you're saying is also good news, right? I mean, there are parts of the world that top the presidential daily briefing, and not for good reasons. And so, in a sense, maybe that's a good thing. But I get the lament that for economic reasons, Latin America isn't higher up on the agenda. But Moisés, the other thing that often tends to be the issue that comes up in the United States when people even think of Latin America is immigration. That too doesn't always come up in the right way.
Rightly so, and you're absolutely right. And so when you look at the numbers in terms of investments from in the part of the United States and USA that would require to create more jobs and personal safety in places like Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, it's peanuts. It's not that important, and it can make a difference, and it can be the most powerful tool, much more powerful than the wall. If you provide people with opportunities to have jobs, to feel safe when they go into streets, that the children are getting a basic education, that there is water, electricity, if you only get that, you immediately reverse the pressures that are expelling people and exporting people to the United States. But there will always be a problem that no wall will contain, which is the gap between salaries and incomes between one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest nation in the world, and some of the poorest. So when you have that gap, and people are desperate to have a life, it's going to always be part of the debate, and you will hear things like what we have heard from the Trump campaign, for example, about the wall and everything that about.